Forget trying to cool an overheating planet. In a few short years, the burning issue facing humanity has quickly become how to adapt and afford the new normal. A summer of droughts in Europe, floods in places like Pakistan and Nigeria, and searing temperatures all around. Just the latest illustration of what's at stake at the COP27 climate summit in Egypt. Despite the peril we all face, deals that put common interest over national rivalries seem harder than ever to achieve as nations compete for limited resources in an energy crisis compounded by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Speaking of rivalries, will those rising tensions between the planet's top two polluters, the US and China, slow down or speed up the transition away from fossil fuels? And will rich nations finance the levees, wind farms, and all the rest it takes to make this whole world livable for all? What happens if they do not? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the price to pay for the changes we're experiencing. And joining us from Stanford, California, she was a delegate at COP26, Hannah Hundal, researcher on the impact of climate change at Stanford School of Medicine. I understand you're packing your bags to head towards the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, and that's correct. I'll be headed over to Sharm el-Sheikh very soon, but I'm involved in conversations remotely, and I think there's so much to discuss with this current round of negotiations, and I'm looking forward to seeing how everything pans out.
Thanks so much for being with us. Thanks as well from Miami to Mektelawit Mesei, Ethiopian doctoral researcher at Florida International University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're in the company of Nicolas Mélan, Senior Advisor at EV Volumes, EV standing for
Electric Vehicle. Good
Electric
evening.
Vehicles.
Good evening, François.
Thanks for being with us again. And covering that COP27 UN summit for us is France 24 Environment Editor, Valerie de Kemp. How are things, Valerie?
Hi, François. Very good. Been covering the conference all day and for another 2 days, hoping to head back to my hotel pretty soon.
All right. Not yet. The France 24 debate where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate.
Humanity has a choice, cooperate or perish. It is either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact.
Or a collective suicide pact. Before we delve into the lofty issues at hand, if you had been sleeping in a cave for 20 years and you heard this pronouncement, you would be shocked. But we've had a lot of COP summits since, and those who cover it regularly. What do you do when you're the United Nations Secretary General? How do you message it? Are those the right words to use?
Well, I'd rather, I've heard that. Look, we've been doing wrong for the last 25 years, but now we have a plan. We understood that when we started the COP back in 1995, that's also when China in 2001 joined the World Trade Organization. And what happened is that we delocalized 20% of all the plants globally from rich countries to poor countries, from decarbonized electricity to coal. And this is why actually since we started the COP, the CO2 emission never increased that fast. Because what we do is we just produce things made of coal, made of China.
And things that are outsourced. So that's the problem there. Let me ask you just very briefly, Hannah Hundal, when you hear Antonio Guterres' words, how do you grab people's attention? How, at each summit, we've already heard them from leaders like France's Emmanuel Macron, Britain's Rishi Sunak already. These calls to act now, these calls for urgency. What kind of language needs to be used?
Absolutely. Well, I think the language needs to be really focused on the present and not so much on the future, because oftentimes we'll frame climate change in terms of 2030 targets, 2050 targets, and that can be really difficult for the average person to grasp. But in reality, the average person can take a look around if, given the appropriate messaging, to see that the climate crisis is here and now. I mean, Kenya is experiencing its worst drought in 40 years. France 24 just did a piece on Rwandan tea leaf farmers who are being utterly devastated by having to increasingly go to higher ground to plant their crop. You look at the floods happening in Nigeria. even in the U.S., the Central Valley of California, which produces 8% of the U.S.'s agricultural output, is being devastated by lack of access to water. So really framing these issues in terms of the impacts that people are seeing, feeling, and experiencing right now is the type of messaging I think that we absolutely need going forward.
All right, look at the present, not the future. Let's look at the present in the host country. The scramble for limited resources includes, of course, renewables. Just ask natives of Egypt. They've seen wither the river that spawns many a civilization. Matthew Thompson has that story.
The waters of the Nile, a symbol of prosperity in Egypt since ancient times, are no longer enough to support the needs of a growing population. Even more so since Ethiopia has built the gigantic Renaissance Dam upstream, allowing it, as of this year, to regulate the river's flow. 98% of the country's 109 million inhabitants, like Yasser, are directly dependent on the river. 500 kilometres further north are the fertile lands of the Nile Delta, Egypt's breadbasket. Since time immemorial, they've used the Nile's waters to irrigate the fields here.
So you see the water comes from here and it leaves over there.
Mohammed grows rice and needs to flood his land. Since agriculture accounts for 80% of the consumption of drinkable water in Egypt, the government has imposed stricter controls on the use of resources.
We have 3 or 4 days of water and 2 or 3 dry days. During the 3 days of water, the field is completely flooded. During the dry days, there's a bit of water for those who want to add a bit. Water is still available. It's not a problem.
But the system of rotation doesn't suit everyone. Further north, where the land is less rich, Sobi's family has been growing jute for generations. It too is a crop that needs plenty of water, but he is at the back of the queue.
I want to irrigate, he wants to irrigate, that guy too. Everyone wants their turn. Okay, but how do we do it? We try to work one after the other. But sometimes the priority is given to rice, which is a priority crop for the state. Jute is also one of the priority crops, but the yields aren't the same, so rice comes first.
For more than 10 years, rising sea levels have led to higher salt content, which is degrading Sobi's lands. He's losing heart.
I was born here, but if there's nothing left, where should I go? I'm going to have to give it all up and leave. It's over. I'm going to have to take my chances elsewhere.
To help farmers, the Egyptian government, with international assistance, has made huge investments in water treatment facilities. The Gab Al Asfar plant is the biggest of its kind in all of Africa and the Middle East. Every day, it treats the water used by 12 million people, more than half the population of Cairo.
We use this water for agriculture. Instead of using large amounts of drinking water, we provide farmers with treated water. At the moment, we produce 2.5 million cubic meters per day, and by 2027, we hope to reach 3.5 million.
In a country where social inequality is on the rise, more and more seaside resorts are popping up aimed at the middle classes. Right along the Mediterranean, the entire coastline to the west of Alexandria has been concreted over. But the Nile doesn't reach this far, so people here must use groundwater filtering in from the sea instead.
Yeah, interesting. When you look at that report, you see the scarcity of water in Egypt. Mekdelawit Mesei, of course, your native Ethiopia is upstream from there. There's hot controversy between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Grand Renaissance Dam. Both countries have populations that are growing, and both need the water not just for agriculture, but also for power as a way to feed their electrical grids.
Correct. Yeah. A couple of things. When we think about the Nile, we have to stop framing it in the perspective of only Ethiopia or just Egypt. The Nile is shared by 11 countries, so that means the Nile is needed and used by 11 countries, or rather, it should be. It's going to be used by 11 countries. But you're right. As you mentioned, Ethiopia has a growing population. Most basic necessities in Ethiopia are not fulfilled. Energy and agriculture or irrigation being the major ones. Demand is also increasing in all of these Nile Basin countries, all 11, not just Ethiopia, not just Egypt. So the demand for water and the demand for consumptively, the irrigation water, is going to increase. Ethiopia hasn't even started using water consumptively. And this is what makes the case for collaborative use. If you think countries are in scarcity now, just think a couple of years ahead when population is going to increase, the quality of life is going to increase, and each and every country is going to need more than what is available in the basin. So
let me ask you on that, Migdalawi. If you look at the Nile, is it an example, an illustration of something where there is enough for everyone to reap the profits of switching to a renewable energy, in this case, hydroelectric?
There's only enough for everyone if we collaborate, if we use these resources, these shared resources, in an integrated manner. Just looking at the water, it's not going to be enough. But capitalizing on location efficiency, for example, there's immense hydropower potential in the basin, which can ideally cater for the total energy needs of the entire basin. There's immense irrigation potential in the basin. And if we do capitalize on location efficiency, choose our crops, choose our irrigation methods very smartly, thinking about the future and thinking long term, then there is the potential to use the resources in the basin for the long term, for the entire basin. But again, that needs concerted, integrated collaboration between countries, which does require high political will, which at the moment is lacking, sadly.
Yeah, the need for a multilateral solution. We're going to get back to that point. Just want to point out, we heard in that report that farmer wondering aloud if he's going to have to move because of climate change. On the sidelines of the COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, France's president discussed climate action with a panel of African youth. What to do, they ask, if adapting to the new normal means moving house.
I'm making a plea so that you can ease geographic mobility, because if we cannot travel, we cannot share our hopes and our common values.
I think that we change even quicker by showing that there are results and by doing projects that are concrete, local, and involve a lot of partnerships. Mobility is part of that.
La mobilité en fait partie.
Well, joining our conversation from Oslo is Sunny Kapoor, Managing Director of Policy Consultants Redefine. Thanks for joining us here in the France 24 debate. You heard Emmanuel Macron in his response there saying, we're going to help out, we're going to concert, but he basically hinting that he doesn't want any more migrants coming his way. Is it off topic to be discussing migration when we talk about climate?
It's central to the issue at hand, and it's off topic, and let me explain how. So the context in which migration is often discussed in relation to the climate crisis is essentially Fortress Europe, right? It's for reasons good and bad, used as something, hey, we already don't want more African migrants. We already have thousands drowning in the Mediterranean, and unless and until we do something to tackle the climate crisis, there's going to be many, many more of them, right? So, it's sort of pointing towards a solution we need anyways, but using an argument that is dangerously xenophobic and implicitly sort of racist, right? So that's why one has to be very careful how migration is discussed in the climate crisis. But the reason it's central is, at the end of the day, right, within 20 years or so, Nigeria alone is expected, according to the latest UN projections, have more than 400 million people. which is expected in the next 20 years to be larger than the population of the entire European Union, right? There is nothing we can do, whatever policy we might adopt in the EU, to keep desperate people at bay if our actions in the past and ongoing inability to act on climate make their homes uninhabitable and their existence there intolerable. And that's the track we are on.
That's the track we're on, and it brings us to what's kind of been, I guess you could say, the heart of the matter here, the buzzword of the week of the next fortnight, if you will, at this COP27 summit is loss and damage. That's the term that's being used, with big polluters like the UK openly contemplating compensation to imperiled nations. We have had Joe Biden expected to unveil a framework for carbon credits sold to businesses with proceeds funding clean energy projects. Quote, this is from the Financial Times, although the scheme would be voluntary. John Kerry, the U.S.'s climate envoy, saying recently he hoped the private sector could be enticed to the table. Spell it out for us, please, Valerie de Kim. Again, this concept, how does it work?
Well, loss and damage is probably one of the most controversial items in climate diplomacy and climate negotiations. It always has been, probably ever since we've had UN climate summits. And it refers to a funding mechanism meant to compensate poorer nations, developing countries, for climate-related disasters they simply can't avoid, they can't adapt to. And the tricky question, though, is who should pay for that fund. Developing nations would argue that the West should pay. Wealthy nations, as they are responsible for the climate crisis. They have contributed the most to the problem that we're seeing at the moment with global warming. Wealthy nations, on the other hand, they have been resisting this idea of loss and damage for years, more than 30 years probably, as they are concerned that it could set a precedent and that they would be held accountable essentially for climate-related disasters happening in other countries. Now, what's different perhaps now is that with disasters becoming more frequent, more severe, it's becoming harder and harder for countries to ignore this question of loss and damage. And that is why this year, for the first time in the history of UN climate summits, loss and damage has been put as an official item on the agenda. So quite clearly, the pressure is mounting. We've heard, for example, today from several developing countries, Senegalese President Macky Sall, for example, taking to the podium saying Africa is only responsible for 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we are on the front lines of climate change. What has also caught my attention walking around some of the pavilions perhaps is the slogan used by the Pakistani pavilion that says what happens in Pakistan does not stay in Pakistan. And that refers, of course, to deadly floods that hit the country earlier this year, and demands by Pakistan and by other countries that wealthy nations be held accountable for the climate crisis. What's going to matter now at COP27 is how far discussions will go in terms of actually creating a loss and damage funding mechanism. And I think the majority of people here, or at least commentators, would predict that it is quite unlikely that we will see a loss and damage funding mechanism by the end of the 2 weeks here at COP27.
Yeah, and Hannah Hundal, the United States set to propose that the private sector be incentivized to help pay for it. I mean, is this the responsibility of governments, i.e. the taxpayers, or is it the responsibility of corporations?
I think both, and I think this, frankly, is an issue that we're not going to be able to run away from. We saw at the closing plenary of COP26 last year, so many countries, developing countries from the G77 and China group, from the Association of Small Island States, expressed their profound disappointment at the US and the European Union deciding to abandon the idea of establishing a funding facility for loss and damage. And I think it's particularly significant that this year, for the first time ever, that's been included in the official agenda. And I think this is an issue that, again, it's going to be almost a prerequisite for developing countries to want to meet at these summits. You know, it takes a lot of manpower and resources for some delegations to even attend these summits. And they need something more than rhetoric. And so I think loss and damage is going to be an issue that we're not going to be able to outrun. And governments and the private sector are going to have to come together to figure it out.
And we have at the same time, Nicolas Mélan, I'll put it to you, the European Union, which is critical of the U.S.'s big infrastructure spending program, saying that it's disguised protectionism when they incentivize people to shorten those supply chains and to build things that are made in the USA in a green fashion, they're saying. Even that, they say, is disguised subsidies.
Yeah, that's what we've seen the last couple of months. For example, Joe Biden, who managed to put in place what Donald Trump never did, which is an incentive to buy America for electric cars with their electric battery. And it's a big problem for Europe because not only now the US is incentivizing those kind of vehicles, but also we have the price of energy which skyrocket compared to the USA, compared to China.
So are free trade and going green compatible?
No, I don't think so. And that's what we're seeing after 27 COP, where finally we haven't seen any improvement, because in 2022 we would have never emitted that much CO2 in the whole history of humanity. And obviously you need some protectionism. What do we need to get rid of? We need to get rid of coal. Coal is 60% of CO2 emission increase since 2000. It's half of our CO2 emission increase, and basically is we are living in a world made of coal. China, India, Germany, we need to get rid of this coal. And for that, we need to put in place, I'll give you an example for electric vehicle, for example. In France, we give you 6,000 euros if you want to buy an electric car. Wherever the battery comes from. And 80% of the battery of electric cars that come from China, made out of coal. We could say, I will give you 6,000 euros, but I want the carbon footprint of your battery to be limited to make sure it's not produced with fossil fuel. And this is something we could generalize on all the goods we consume, and that's a way to get rid of coal and finally have CO2 emission decrease.
Sunny Kapoor, you agree?
Well, I don't really agree, and let me explain why. I think this is a very marginal discussion, the issue of protectionism. Let me explain why. So if you just look at the numbers, the OECD, the rich world, the US, the EU, and Japan, we remain globally financially systemic because we have something like 80% of the world's assets under management, and we are technologically systemic, right? But from the perspective of the environment and from the demographic perspective, we are marginal actors. The EU could reach net zero tomorrow, and we would still suffer deeply from climate change till and until we can incentivize large emerging economies like India, regions like sub-Saharan Africa, where the majority of the world's population is and where the majority of energy growth is going to come from, to embark on a very different developmental path that is different not just from what the US and the EU used, but also from what Japan, Korea, and China have used. So India, for example, if India went down the Chinese developmental pathway, there is no way we are staying under 2 degrees, right? So the substantial question is, what can bring large emerging economies, developing countries, many of whose citizens are aspirationally, they want to have improved their lives and don't have access to energy or capital, round the table to embark on a path that is much more difficult, that has a much larger upfront capital cost, and capital is the one thing that developing countries don't have, till and until we put something substantial on the table. And we have been, and absolute abject failure, not even being able to meet the measly 100 billion commitment from 10 years back, which frankly will be something like 0.1% of the actual cost of the transition, right? So we're talking about, and again, we get stuck in these marginal issues of, a subsidy here, a subsidy there, protectionism or not.
But Sonny, let me ask you on that, because you had the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's government, according to the Daily Telegraph, which is considering this concept of loss and damage. It's something the opposition Labour Party is asking for. Right now, Britain seems to have a little bit of a hole in its budget deficit, though.
Well, again, just the numbers game. So there was a very, very, very measly, sort of, symbolic €2 million or $2 million commitment made by Scotland to sort of a loss and damage fund, right? I mean, so we have, so there's three parts. There's mitigation, how to stop further climate change happening, right? How to reduce emissions. Then there's adaptation, which is how to deal with emissions and the damage that is already locked in, but to make the developmental outcome better. And then there is loss and damage, which is all the numbers that where we have failed to adapt. So loss and damage comes because we have failed to mitigate and we have failed to adapt. And then it's the loss and damage, right? So right now, there is no money on the table, more or less, for mitigation, which is, the 100 billion, which hasn't materialized. It needs to be at least 10 times larger, if not more. There is no money on the table for adaptation, which is already, based on climate change that is locked in, going to be trillions of dollars of cost. And there is no money on the table for loss and damage, 2 million measly amount, when the actual cost in lives, quality of lives, and opportunities lost for countries is going to be in the order of trillions of dollars. So anything that comes out, any numbers that come out, that are going to be so completely inconsequential that I wouldn't blame emerging economies, developing economies, to just walk away and say, you know what, this is not a serious conversation.
Mcdonald Massey, how do you see it? What would you like, and what are you expecting when it comes to this issue of who pays for mitigation and the switch?
I mostly agree with the previous speaker. I think the pollution pays principle is a sensible one. Advanced economies, developed economies have to take the responsibility and have to be at the forefront of this mitigation and transition. And so that includes financially supporting this transition as well. So not only do they have the ethical responsibility to be at the forefront of this climate fight and the transition to a green economy, but they also have the capacity, which makes sense for them to actually be at the forefront. Moreover, this is not a talk about individual economies, but the well-being of the entire world as a whole. We cannot tell emerging economies to not go down the path that these emerged or the advanced economies actually went through, or we cannot ask them to not increase their quality of life. But we cannot afford to have these developing countries, including my own country, including many countries in Africa, many countries in South America and Asia, to not increase their lifestyle, but we cannot afford to have them go down the road that these advanced economies went through. So it actually makes sense for advanced economies to pave the way and support these developing countries, emerging economies financially, so that we don't compound this impending climate change issue. I think there can be many arguments made to the point that the polluter pays principle has to be enforced, and that these developing countries, advanced economies, have to be at the forefront. And the financial contribution is just a starting point. It's the least they can do, honestly.
Hannah Undal, how do you calculate the polluter pays principle? You heard earlier Nicolas Mélan describing the outsourcing of goods, the manufacture of things that pollute by Europeans to China.
Yeah, it's going to be tricky, and it's definitely going to be difficult. And I think what keeps being highlighted is this idea that people whose lives and livelihoods are being destroyed, these industries that are being gutted by extreme weather events, these are contributors to the global economy. And so it's really not an option for so-called rich countries to be insular and to look inwards and to think that they can outrun this issue. This is going to come back to haunt them if we don't address this now. And so I think that's really the key issue here.
But then why isn't it more of an issue where you are? I understand there's an election tomorrow.
There is. There are the U.S. midterm elections coming up, and it's going to be interesting because right now there's predicted to be a shakeup in the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Senate is still up for grabs. You know, when President Biden was inaugurated, he really came in as the climate president, made very bold promises on climate action. And I think the issue has been that in the past couple of years, we've seen the U.S. take a step forward and a step back, and a step forward and a step back. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 has been one of the largest climate packages to ever pass, hundreds of billions of dollars going towards reducing the U.S.'s reliance on fossil fuels and increasing the transition towards renewables. That's great news. But at the same time, we saw the U.S. Supreme Court in the decision West Virginia versus EPA take a bite out of the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate carbon dioxide emissions. And you had so many people from various sectors of the U.S., even the medical community, come out and say this is a terrible decision. It's going to impact children's health, lung conditions, skin health. I mean, the impacts are going to be huge. And so I think tomorrow we're going to really see the future of the U.S.'s commitment to a lot of these issues up for grabs.
So whatever Joe Biden promises when he comes to Egypt will be null and void if he doesn't have control of Congress?
I think it'll be very difficult to actually pass some of these measures, as lofty and as wonderful as they might sound, if we see a shakeup in the legislature tomorrow. You know, a great example is the Inflation Reduction Act was really carried through by Democrats. All of the Republicans opposed it. And so as much as we can talk about these issues and as much as I think President Biden is committed to addressing climate change, without the political backing to do so, it's going to be very difficult.
Joe Biden expected in Sharm el-Sheikh, Brazil's president-elect Lula also. The Indian prime minister, he's not scheduled to attend. And as for China, it's got a big pavilion, a 40-strong delegation, but newly re-elected President Xi Jinping won't be attending, Nicolas Méran. He won't be attending, and more importantly, Joe Biden's special envoy for climate, he's the former Secretary of State, John Kerry. We can take a listen to him. He is saying the door is still open for talks. That's because there had always been these bilateral talks. Those are the two biggest polluters on the planet. Right now, they've been off since August when Beijing stopped those bilateral climate talks after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
Well, we have said from day one that we stand ready to sit down with China on the climate issue and work together to solve what is not a bilateral issue, but what is a universal, global, existential issue. And there is no solution to the problem of climate change without China, without Russia, without India, without large countries, large economies being at the table.
Nicolas Méran,
what I'm understanding from either European leaders but also the US, what are we doing now? What are we doing now? We are subsidizing China to use more and more coal. That's what we're doing. When we decide to get rid of the gas of the main producer globally, replace it with shale gas, which emits a lot of methane, replace it with a lot of coal, because basically what China is doing is it is using coal to produce electricity and selling us the gas very expensive. This is what we're doing right now.
China's been ahead of Europe and the United States when it comes to the switch to renewables for years.
Well, they still produce 70% of the electricity out of coal. So yes, they build a lot of renewable. But today, in 2021, it was the first time we used that much coal to produce electricity. And we are forcing them to use more and more coal. And actually, you know what? We are also doing it in Europe. We are using coal opening coal plants in Germany, in the UK, in Netherlands.
But politicians here say that's a stopgap because we need to get through this winter after the sudden cutting of the tap.
It's not a stopgap because we will need gas next year when we don't get it from Russia. And what we will do is we will buy it from China, who buys it from Australia, Qatar and Russia, and they will replace this gas with more coal. So we obviously have a big problem here, and we don't have the start of the solution.
Sunny Kapoor, when you hear politicians talk about that this is basically because we're having to make this quick switch because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the switch away from Russian oil and gas, that's the reason why we're getting a little bit more coal this year.
Well, I mean, you get someone who lies to you once, you give them the benefit of doubt, twice. But year after year, with false promises made on moving towards, tackling climate change, means that whatever comes out of the mouth of politicians, particularly, on climate in the EU and the US, it simply cannot be taken at face value, right? So had this temporary spike in coal consumption come after a decade of very serious, substantial, investments into tackling climate, both in Europe and globally, etc., perhaps. But that's not the point, right? I mean, it hasn't been. And I think, on the sort of China bashing, there's many very good reasons to bash China. But this is not one of them. For every argument that can be made that we are sort of implicitly subsidizing, Chinese coal consumption, an even stronger argument can be made that China has subsidized the cost reduction of solar and wind in a manner, and at hundreds of billions of dollars, in a manner that will be of global benefit, because those technologies are now cheap, mostly because of two reasons. One is the Energiewende in Germany, which sort of ended up unintentionally, losing at the cost of several tens of billions of dollars to German taxpayers, scaling up the early production of solar and wind. And since then, it's been mostly Chinese subsidies. So I think, let's be careful in pointing fingers, and definitely not pointing fingers, when we are in the EU or the US. And our track record is as horrible and atrocious as it is.
Mektalawit Messeh, you agree?
I agree. I completely agree. I think the finger pointing and the blaming does not really help us so much while these COP meetings and this big delegations are important in terms of getting all major players together. But I think it's high time that we actually put some action to the words. We have seen some minor changes ever since the Copenhagen Accord in 1992, and this is where language like what you started with at the beginning of this program, framing climate change as an existential issue really serves a purpose, because it really is an existential issue. So I think it's high time that we put some action to the words. And if you really do believe that this is an existential issue and that we're all in it in the long haul, I don't see where this blaming each other and myopic national agendas only where that's going to take us. I understand the intricacies of global economies and that it's very hard, especially in situations like the US, to pass climate agreements in the current climate scenario, but thinking outside of national borders and thinking as a globe, and as a person who comes from a developing country, thinking in terms of the millions who are actually trying to fulfill their basic necessities, I think these high-level discussions about blaming each other when we're talking about luxuries and extreme excesses, they don't really serve a purpose. So I think it's high time. I think it's time for action.
Nicolas Mélan, has the action, though, begun? We are seeing, you can see it in the streets of Paris, more people using bicycles, fewer using cars. You're seeing, I know it's not enough. We're seeing as well the number of those electric vehicles that you know well starting to rise.
If you want to be a bit provocative, one could say that Vladimir Putin did more to climate than 26 COPs. Because we've never talked that much as of energy saving, reduced eating and all these kind of things since we decide to get rid of Mr. Putin energy, oil and gas. And that's the good thing for the climate, except if we would not transfer it to coal outside of Europe. So yes, but let me give you two numbers. COP 2021, the rich countries should have given 100 billion euros to the poor countries. And today, we are not there yet. But what we need is not 100 billion euros per year. We need 2,000 billion euros per year from rich countries to poor countries. It's 4% GDP. And when you look at the final state of rich countries, unfortunately, I doubt it will happen.
Hannah Hundal, do you agree with Nicolas that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has done more to boost energy transition than 26 climate summits?
That's a large claim. I'm not sure if I agree entirely with that claim, but I do agree with the underlying sentiment that Russia's war in Ukraine has really showed the need for us to build better infrastructure to withstand climate-driven impacts. I mean, of course, we can say that the energy crisis currently going on was catalyzed by the war, but quite frankly, our lack of ability to withstand those impacts speaks to this larger issue of our lack of preparedness to actually confront the climate crisis head on. And so if anything, I think this has definitely opened the door for conversation. I think it's a tricky situation, right? Because on the one hand, we don't want populations to needlessly suffer. And so we're kind of seeing in the short term, some ramping up of coal usage, for example, in order to support populations throughout this trying time. But so although we might see some unfortunate sort of steps backward in the short term, I think in the long term, this really is an important opening of the door to conversations about just how ill-prepared we are to confront this changing future.
Sunny Kapoor?
I think so. The way it helps is it indirectly puts climate change squarely on the national security agenda. After this invasion, there is not a single Secret Service, National Security Council, military in the world which will not be having serious discussions about reducing significantly the dependence on energy imports and energy security, and particularly at a time when some of the largest imports for all countries come from what are essentially strange, unpredictable dictatorships in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere, right? It just really doubles. So I think short-term effect negative on climate. But over the next 5-year horizon, it would have contributed. It wouldn't have contributed more than sort of 10 COPs put together, but a substantial additional reason over and above caring for the lives of people, caring about your economy, caring about a more stable macroeconomic environment, caring about the pollution from coal and the 10 million deaths that causes, etc. Now, national security imperatives also point all in the same direction. So we are in this unique window of opportunity where the economic, financial, humanitarian, moral, developmental, and national security cases all point towards an urgent scale up in tackling climate change. And if we fail to do this in the next year or two, scale up our efforts, then we would have missed that window.
And as Magdalena said earlier in our conversation, that will nonetheless require agreements that go beyond national borders. I want to thank you, Magdalena, for joining us from Miami. I want to thank Hannah Hundal for being with us from Stanford. Sunny Kapoor in Oslo. Nicolas Mélan, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.